I was doing a sheet actually in a meeting this morning, and the number of shows that don't have incentives just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The message we're getting is that you guys really want us there. You want us back. You get that it's a competitive global landscape right now, and the infrastructure you have there is so filmmaker friendly. You make it easy for us, like 1 or 2 phone calls, and if you guys start rolling things out left and right. And Gene, on Leftovers, they were considering and Gene can talk a little bit about that. The scout gets arranged, you're there. I mean, you guys start calling us on the phone. What else can we do to help? So it's extraordinary that way, because it's not just the incentive, it's all those things together. And it's, when making a movie, it's a lot of people. There's infrastructure. We need help with the government. We have there's a lot of things going on, and the support you give us is great, and we really appreciate that. But that's one of the things that really does stand out in our minds when we think about Australia.
I mean, it's Ausfilm. They bring us down there. They pave the way. Ausfilm, who go a step beyond to get us the incentives and to also pay for the scouts, pave the way, make the filmmakers feel comfortable. They're great. Deb's amazing, by the way. Sincere.
The first film I worked on in Australia, it had to be like 1990.
95.
That was a very successful, low-budget film. And I'm somewhat surprised that we're even talking about rationales for people to go to Australia, because that was 25 years ago, 22 years ago. And my latest experience in Australia is a very competitive production environment, because I've shot worldwide. And to me, there's no reason to have to sell Australia that hard in my mind, because it has so much to offer. What I'm finding is that where the incentives matter most, of course, is for the very big dramas, because the ambition, especially now with the competition, is for the showrunners to want to outdo one another in terms of the scope and the scale of the project.
Jonathan and Zare on the phone came into our office, 3 years ago?
Yeah.
3 years ago, and pitched us this idea. They wanted to do Peter Rabbit movie. They wanted to partner with a filmmaker. We immediately fell in love with it and fell in love with them, and together sold to Sony. And so have one of the greatest animation houses and visual effects houses in the world as our partners on this movie and as producers on this movie. And because of that, because they were sort of leading the way of it, Will and I were really the only Americans, I guess, and one of the writers also, one of the other writers, but we're able to get the full 40% producer offset. And so this was a big Sony movie, but done as a full Australian production. And the fun part of shooting in Australia, besides riding your bike to work and going to the beach all the time, is that your crew and who you have to pick from is insane. I mean, we had 8 Oscar winners on our movie. The big movement for Animal, and what Jonathan is here in LA doing, is to become a real, to be Pixar, to be Illumination, to take their skills and really turn themselves into real producers. And this movie for Zare, as the first P producer, not just a vendor for hire movie for Animal Logic.
The creator he's a big fan of 2 Australian movies, Picnic at Hanging Rock and The Last Wave. And if you've seen The Leftovers, thematically, all of those themes are very similar. He wanted to move them away from where they started and towards something that would enlighten them. And he, just the phrase that's used for Australia, down under, was very appealing to him. So he began to think about Australia probably in season 2. And that's when I came on to the show. But I said, by the way, I've worked in Australia, and I think maybe it would be a fabulous place to take this family. And he said, well, I've been thinking about that for a while.
What was interesting at the time is that the series had moved to Texas. Texas, they've been under some pressure about their incentive. And we were calling up, and I was talking to Gene, and we were negotiating, and said, well, Texas can only give us so much money for 3rd season. So there was this additional pressure that we couldn't actually, we weren't going to get incentive money for the whole season, which played right into looking for another place where there was an incentives.
And I know Ridley Scott, he was impressed by the crew having to turn around 98 sets in a short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, people like Ian Gracie, spectacular, world-class best art director in the world. When Ridley left, he wants to go back. I mean, usually, he's at Pinewood, then you leave Pinewood at night, you got to drive all the way into Soho to watch your dailies, and suddenly, not to Fox Studio Australia, you walk across the street, see the dailies, and then you're surrounded by some of the greatest restaurants in the world. I mean, amazing. And he shot 10-hour days, it's the 6 to 8, and I'm sorry, 8 to 6, pardon me. He had the best time. And the movie was, he loved the actors, he loved the crew. It was just a wonderful experience for him.
Essentially, we originated at Animal Logic. We knew that Peter Rabbit was coming into the public domain, and we saw an opportunity there. So we just kind of went through the traditional development process in which, we found a writer, Rob Lieber, who's an American writer, and our sort of process at Animal Logic, because it had been a while since we had actually had a film produced. We knew we wanted to partner with another production company, but we wanted to do it with someone, that there was various strategies involved with who we wanted to partner with, and Olive Bridge seemed perfect because very much of like what Animal Logic, what we did with the Lego movie was try to sort of contemporize and kind of take something that could have been sort of perceived as young and make it something that wasn't, as we like to call it, parent Punisher, and make it a little bit more of, a little bit edgier and more sophisticated. And Will was kind of the perfect filmmaker for that. And so we came, as Jodi said, we brought the project to them. And Will was amazing, actually, because Will was on set, wasn't he, on Annie at the time? And he was literally driving home from set when we did the pitch to him over the phone, and was completely attentive and literally had questions for us that were pretty deep and questions. And we were like, this is the guy. If he wants to do it, this is the guy. And then immediately it was like, I think at midnight that night, we closed the deal with Hannah Minghella. It was like they were really anxious to get on board with it.
The Australians have a great deal of pride in what they do and what they can deliver. And if a guy from a low-budget production company is going to ask them to work for almost no money, they will do it, because they have a great love of film. But if an executive from a motion picture studio is going to ask them to work for no money, that's not going to work.
It was a bit of an outlier because it's set in Australia. Tim Winton, I'll guess that if you haven't heard of Tim Winton, you're probably not Australian. And I hadn't heard of him, but it was just this very intense, authentic, visceral voice, almost like reading Cormac McCarthy for the first time, with such a vernacular of the local language and mannerism and everything like that. And I read it in this book, Breath, which is a coming-of-age story set in the world of surfing, and it's set in Western Australia. And I gave it to Mark, my boss, and said, this is really an outlier. It's set in the 70s. It takes some dark turns. It's about kids and surfing, and I don't know, you just got to read it. It's that good. And he read it, and we actually reached out to Tim Winton, and it was funny listening to Bruna's story about Big Little Lies. Tim actually tried to sell us on making the movie in California and setting it there, and as it turns out, all he was trying to do was basically keep his private surfing spots a secret.
Different breaks in California.
Yeah.
The most Australian thing I've ever heard.
And so it was around that time. It was a little bit, probably about a year later. We had optioned the book, and we were figuring out how to put it together. And we had sent it to Simon Baker, who was a friend of ours, going back to a TV show called The Guardian. And we, at around the same time, started working on 2 movies at the same time in Australia, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, and the third Narnia film in Queensland, and just came to know what I'm sure most of you know about the ingenuity and
just the power of the Australian crew. And it had always sort of been our thought to make the movie in Australia. But what sort of dawned on us around that time was, let's try to make this as Australian a movie as possible. And as far as the Western Australian aspect of it goes, it was always, I think, our pipe dream to shoot it in Western Australia, but none of us really took it that seriously because it's sort of, it felt like breaking new ground. Why would we go shoot somewhere that, that far off the map? And we'll probably end up shooting it in northern New South Wales or, somewhere close to where, Simon grew up and, he knows the territory. And we actually did a scout, as I recall, with Ian Gracie, whose name keeps coming up. He pointed out some spots, and they all look good. And then several drafts of the script later, it became clear, and Jamie can probably jump more into this, but the actual viability of financing it with a good chunk of the money in grants from Western Australia became apparent, and we started nosing around. I know you guys did a scout there. I did some Skypes with people like Tim White and talked to some people that had shot there, the guys who did Drift and that sort of thing, and they're saying, no, you can actually make a movie there.
So, and Peter Rabbit is a really good example because Animal Logic started that project and then brought it over here. And Breath is another one, just it's inherently Australian. It doesn't matter if your story's not Australian. We're not here to make Australian films. We're here to make films, but start early, because if you start the project in Australia, if you look at The Great Gatsby, it's one of the great American novels. It has Leonardo DiCaprio. It's an Australian movie. Again, that's got a lot to do with the director. But if Animal Logic over here, Will's not an Australian director. It just qualified for the 40%, which is really interesting. But that started early. So if you want the location offsets, that's fine. Get them anytime. If you want to build it so you qualify for a really large portion of your budget, start at the idea stage, call up an Australian producer, call up an Australian writer, call up an Australian director, start early. They can start having the engaging with you, and it makes it much easier later when you're trying to get a big chunk of the budget.
Sorry,
just two other things I wanted to add. One is we shoot all around the world, and we shot. I remember we did a film in Thailand. It was primarily an Australian crew. The efficiency. I remember walking on the set, and they were doing 30 setups a day and weren't blinking. And it was the efficiency was just kind of like astounding to be in that part of the world. And recently, HBO Asia, which does programming over in that part of the world, they'd been doing some things in Singapore and around, and they wanted to kind of take their original up to the next level. Where they reach out to Australia, and they did co-production with Australia. They brought the writers and the directors up from Australia, and it just the whole thing just went up by a whole to another level. So, and because of that, when we're shooting around Europe or any other place, if there's an issue bringing people from other places, when Australia's mentioned, absolutely, and then people travel well, and it's no big deal, just kind of common knowledge.